Hey there, it's Luke, the founder of Friday, and in this video, I want to walk you through this really interesting piece of research that I found through the Future Forum. For those unaware, the Future Forum is basically a consortium that started by the people over at Slack. I think it includes some other partners. But basically, they do a bunch of research on the future of work and they do some really cool surveys. And I found one of their most recent ones really interesting. And, I think that there's some data in here that I'd like to talk about this kind of dynamic that's unfolding. And in many ways, I think that this has been the case for the last 2 years. I don't think this is a new development, but the basic idea is, as the Future Forum outlines, there's a massive disconnect between what executives want and what they're looking for, as well as what employees want and what they're looking for when it comes to kind of the nature and the role of the office, and how often we go and we visit it. Right. So I'll kind of skim through some of the research. I'll include a link to this because it's really interesting. Um, but let me kind of skim through one of the really important highlights, and then I will work to unpack what I think is really going on. So, so yeah, this is the key findings. Most executives report they are designing post-pandemic workforce policies with little to no direct input from employees. Sounds unfortunate. Um, Sounds like there's a disconnect between employees believing that they're being transparent around the post-pandemic policies, whereas workers do not agree. This was a big one I wanted to unpack. Of those currently working remotely, nearly half of all executives surveyed want to work from the office every day, compared to 17% of employees, which is a 2.6x difference. And 75% of these executives say they want to work from the office 3 to 5 days a week versus only 34% of employees. Well, so yeah, in this video, I'm going to outline and break this down a little bit more. I think the data is pretty obvious. So there's some data in here that I'm a little skeptical of because there's not enough of a delta, at least from my perspective. There's not enough of a difference for there to be some really important takeaways. But what you can see here is that there's a very clear difference, like a very clear difference. Executives want to go back to the office, and of those who want to go back, they really want to go back. They want to spend every day of the week there. Whereas employees are basically the exact opposite. And so, well, why is this? Well, that's what the purpose of the video is about. So before I jump into this diagram that I made, I want to outline kind of the section from one of my favorite books. It's called High Output Management. It's written by Andy Grove, literally the best book on management I've ever read. But in one of the chapters, it's always stuck with me. And I found this blog post that kind of outlines it. But basically, a manager or a leader is responsible for the output of their team and those neighboring teams around them, right? The ones that they influence. And so, as a leader, your job is to increase the output of your team. That's basically it, and those that you're around. So, how do you do this? Well, what Andy Grove talks about in his book is this idea of being like really thoughtful with how you allocate your time and how you kind of leverage your time. And so how can you make decisions and do activities as a leader that dramatically improve the output of your group? And what he says is basically there's kind of three key things that you need to do. You need to gather information, you need to make high quality decisions, and you need to nudge people. And nudging, for those unaware, it's kind of like basic behaviors that you can do to encourage someone to focus in some areas over others, right? It's kind of like that nudge, literally like a nudge. And so the goal here is you kind of need to do those three activities. And so what I would argue, and I put together this presentation or this little thing. Let me just move my screen over. Is that the reason why executives and leaders want to go back to the office is, I believe, kind of twofold. There's two key components, and there's a few things beneath it. So the first I'd like to discuss is this idea of the pain of the office. And so if we think about the most annoying parts of the office and going to the office, the data really indicates that it's kind of two big things. One is the commute, right? So no one or very few people really want to sit in a vehicle and drive 40 minutes each way, right? And so then the second piece is when you're at the office, what is kind of the nature of what you do at the office, right? And so are you collaborating, whiteboarding, hanging out with your coworkers, spending time around the water cooler, having those team meetings, or are you trying to do deep work? And so I would argue that executives are more insulated from the pain of the office compared to the average employee. And here's why. The first is the commute. If I reflect, and I admit this is anecdotal, if I reflect on a lot of the leaders and executives that I've worked with, and if I think about the incentives that drive me as a leader, if I were to set up an office somewhere, I would set it up near my house, or I would choose to relocate closer to the office, full stop. And so as a leader, I am very interested in where that office is. And I have, at the end of the day, kind of the buck stops with me. And so if I just think about the leaders that I've worked with, a lot of them lived near the office, or they built the office, or they located the office near where they live. That's just the reality of the situation, especially for a young startup. And you can take issue with that, but that's what I see. And then the second is the pain of the office when it comes to distractions. And so, the Future Forum article hints at this later in the piece, but executives have, dedicated office space. They have basically control over how the space itself is designed so that they as a leader are able to kind of tap into it, right? So think corner office. And while this is not necessarily true for every leader, this is certainly true for a lot of leaders. Once again, they have the ability to make decisions, and most leaders I know have built the office in a way where it taps into, in many ways, their personal preferences. And so that's part one for why I think executives want to go back to the office is basically they are insulated from the pain that the average person experiences, or they just don't experience it as much. The second and maybe more important ingredient here is what is the job to be done of the office? What job do people hire the office to do? Well, what we know based on research is that meeting up in real life and hanging out in person is best for relationship building, collaboration, and kind of discussing complex topics where that fast feedback loop between participants, whether it's in a meeting or whiteboarding, is really important, right? It's an accelerant. And so we know that meeting up in person is really great for those type of activities. Well, if you think about the role of the leader, most of their role, I would argue, is based around this idea of kind of navigating complicated people issues or strategic issues that require or that are accelerated when you can hang out in person. The second piece here is the information gathering. And so to get back to the high output management book that I mentioned, we have information gathering is the foundation for which a manager or a leader does their day-to-day activities, right? And so I think about information gathering is it's management by walking around. It's kind of, visiting the water cooler, seeing what people are working on. It's walking around and seeing that so-and-so is in the office whiteboarding and isn't that interesting? Let's go chat. It's basically the sum collection of all of the information that a leader takes in when hanging out in the office. And as you can imagine, if their job is the output of their team, it can be helpful to understand what your team is working on and to get that data as quickly as possible, right? So information gathering is a key role of a leader, and it influences the nudging that they do, right? Those kind of tweaks and those little course corrections. And it also influences the decisions that they make, right? You need information to be able to make high quality decisions. So in a nutshell, to get back to this piece of research, I would argue that the reason why leaders want to go back to the office is because of those two things. One, they're insulated from the pain of the office. And two, the job to be done in the office maps much more closely to that of an executive than that of the average employee who spends most of their day doing deep work. And if you look at the history of the office, this was generally true, a few hundred years ago. The reason why the office popped up in the first place is because of kind of coordination issues, and it was a place for leaders to observe employees. And so it should be no surprise that executives want to get back to the office. It's because it makes their job easier, quite frankly. And the only way that we will kind of create kind of a closer mapping between executives and employees is if we work on solving these two issues right here. Specifically, this information gathering piece. How do we make sure that leaders get the information that they need, that they were previously getting in the office that they're not getting right now? And so this is really where we're heavily focused at Friday, is how do we create these predictable streams and flows of information that help leaders and employees understand what's going on at work in a way that is completely asynchronous, where you don't need to rely on the office as much anymore. So anyway, I hope this video makes sense. I think it's a really important discussion because at the end of the day, executives historically have held the keys, right? They're the ones that can just say, hey, everybody's coming back to the office. But now what's happening is that more and more companies are offering remote work, and it's creating a situation where executives cannot just simply say, hey, we're going back, because they might lose employees, right? Employees want the flexibility. So leaders who understand this and tap into this will be much, much more successful in the future. So anyway, I hope this video makes sense. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any thoughts, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.